In the monastery libraries of the 13th century, a student would spend months on a single text of Aristotle. Today, you consume dozens of articles before breakfast. Which student learned more deeply? Which formed true wisdom? The medieval scholars who built universities that still stand today, or the modern student drowning in information yet starving for understanding? I have spent decades observing how the human mind truly learns, and I must tell you something that will challenge everything you believe about education. The ancient methods we used for centuries produced deeper, more lasting intellectual formation than anything modern learning science has devised. This is not nostalgia, it is the recognition that contemplative discipline shapes minds in ways that no technique, however scientifically validated, can match. The difference lies not in information processing, but in the formation of intellectual virtue. Medieval methods transformed the whole person through sustained contemplation, while modern approaches scatter attention across surfaces. Today, I invite you to rediscover why the contemplative path of the medieval schools created minds capable of profound synthesis, and how you can reclaim these timeless principles in our distracted age. The soul that learns to contemplate truth slowly and deeply becomes capable of wisdom that no amount of fast learning can provide. Chapter 1: The Great Reversal, From Contemplation to Consumption. Modern learning science has achieved something remarkable. It has made learning faster, more efficient, and completely superficial. Where medieval students spent years mastering single texts until they became part of their intellectual DNA, today's methods optimize for speed, retention, and forgetting curves. But they have forgotten the most crucial element: transformation. In my years forming serious scholars, I have witnessed the tragic consequences of this reversal. Students arrive knowing hundreds of facts but unable to think connectedly about any profound question. They have been trained in information consumption, not contemplative formation. Modern learning science treats the mind like a computer that needs better programming, when it is actually a garden that requires patient cultivation. The medieval approach was fundamentally different. When a student in Paris studied Aristotle's Ethics, he did not merely learn about virtue, he practiced intellectual virtue through the very manner of his study. The slow, contemplative reading formed habits of attention, patience, and depth that served him throughout life. The text became not just knowledge possessed, but wisdom embodied. Consider the difference. Modern, active reading techniques encourage students to extract key points quickly and move on. Medieval Lectio Divina taught students to dwell with texts until understanding ripened naturally. One produces efficient information processors, the other creates contemplative minds capable of genuine insight. This is why university graduates today can analyze complex data but struggle with fundamental questions about meaning, purpose, and truth. They have been trained in techniques without being formed in intellectual virtue. Their minds have been optimized for speed but not prepared for depth. The contemplative tradition understood that learning is not about acquiring information but about becoming the kind of person who can perceive truth clearly. This transformation requires time, silence, repetition, and the kind of patient attention that modern methods systematically undermine. We have gained efficiency and lost wisdom. Chapter 2: The Science of Scattered Attention versus the Art of Unified Focus. Modern learning science celebrates multitasking, spaced repetition, and rapid context switching as optimizations of human cognitive capacity. These methods treat attention like a resource to be allocated efficiently across multiple streams. But they fundamentally misunderstand the nature of contemplative attention, the unified focus that alone can penetrate to the heart of truth. I have observed how these supposedly scientific methods fragment the intellectual life. Students learn to jump between concepts rapidly, never dwelling long enough for genuine understanding to develop. They master techniques for managing information flow but lose the capacity for sustained contemplation that reveals deeper patterns and connections. The medieval approach cultivated what we called attentio, a quality of mind that could rest steadily on its object without restless movement. This was not mere concentration but contemplative attention that allowed reality to disclose itself gradually. A scholar studying Thomas Aquinas would read the same passage repeatedly, not because he was slow, but because each reading revealed new depths. Consider how different this is from modern, efficient, study methods. Speed reading teaches students to extract information quickly while sacrificing comprehension depth. The Pomodoro technique fragments natural contemplative rhythms into artificial time blocks. Even deep work methods focus on productivity rather than contemplative transformation. The scientific approach analyzes learning as information processing and optimization. The contemplative approach understands learning as a form of prayer, an opening of the mind to receive truth that cannot be grasped but only received. This requires the kind of patient, unified attention that modern methods systematically destroy. When you train your mind to constantly shift between tasks, you develop mental habits of restlessness that make contemplative depth impossible. Your attention becomes like water that cannot pool deep enough to reflect clearly. The medieval scholars understood that intellectual virtue required training attention like spiritual masters train prayer, through sustained, gentle focus that gradually deepens. This is why their graduates became doctors and masters capable of profound original thought, while ours become skilled processors of existing information. Contemplative attention creates minds capable of genuine insight. Scattered attention produces only clever manipulation of data. Chapter 3: The Monastery versus the Laboratory, Two Visions of Human Learning. The fundamental difference between medieval and modern approaches lies in their understanding of what human beings are and how they learn. Modern learning science approaches students as biological machines that can be optimized through better algorithms. The medieval tradition understood students as rational souls capable of contemplating truth itself. This philosophical difference creates entirely different methodologies. Laboratory-based learning science tests variables in isolation. Does background music improve retention? Do colorful highlights enhance memory? Does spacing reviews increase durability? Each study fragments learning into measurable components, missing the integrated wholeness that actually produces wisdom. The monastery classroom operated from a completely different vision. Learning was not optimization but formation, the gradual shaping of a mind capable of perceiving reality clearly. This required not techniques but virtues, patience to dwell with difficult ideas, humility to recognize ignorance, perseverance through intellectual challenges, and contemplative attention that could rest in truth. Modern methods promise quick results through scientifically validated techniques. Medieval methods demanded years of disciplined practice to develop intellectual virtue. One treats symptoms of poor learning, the other transforms the learner's fundamental relationship to truth. Which approach produces minds capable of original insight versus clever manipulation of existing ideas? I have watched brilliant students master every contemporary study technique yet remain incapable of sustained thought about fundamental questions. They can process information efficiently but cannot contemplate deeply enough to generate genuine understanding. Their minds have been trained for performance, not transformation. The laboratory approach assumes that learning is fundamentally a problem to be solved through better methods. The contemplative approach recognizes that learning is a mystery to be entered through disciplined practice. Techniques can be mastered quickly, virtues require lifetime cultivation. This is why medieval universities produced scholars whose works we still study, while modern institutions produce specialists whose research becomes obsolete within decades. The question is not whether medieval methods are more efficient, they are not. The question is whether they produce the kind of minds capable of wisdom that our world desperately needs. Efficiency and transformation often work in opposite directions. Chapter 4: The Lost Art of Intellectual Digestion. Modern learning science has mastered the art of information consumption but forgotten the crucial process of intellectual digestion. Students today can absorb vast amounts of data rapidly, but they lack the contemplative practices necessary to transform information into wisdom. This is like perfecting techniques for eating while eliminating the digestive process that turns food into nourishment. The medieval tradition understood that learning required both reception and rumination. After receiving new ideas through reading or lecture, students engaged in extended periods of contemplative reflection, what we called meditatio. This was not passive reception but active contemplative work that allowed ideas to be thoroughly assimilated into one's intellectual framework. Consider how this differs from contemporary, active learning techniques. Modern methods focus on encoding information efficiently and retrieving it accurately. But they skip the contemplative phase where understanding ripens naturally through sustained reflection. Students learn to manipulate concepts quickly but never develop the patience to let truth reveal itself gradually. I observe students today who can discuss complex theories fluently yet have never spent extended time contemplating what these ideas actually mean for understanding reality. They have learned to perform intellectually without developing intellectual virtue. Their minds process information rapidly but cannot digest it contemplatively. The contemplative tradition taught specific practices for intellectual digestion, repeated reading until understanding deepened naturally, silent reflection that allowed insights to emerge organically, discussion that tested understanding through gentle questioning rather than debate, and solitary meditation where ideas could be integrated into one's growing wisdom. These practices required time, the one resource modern education systematically eliminates. We have optimized for coverage rather than depth, breadth rather than integration, performance rather than transformation. Students learn more topics but understand fewer truths. The result is intellectual malnutrition despite information abundance. Minds trained in consumption but not digestion become bloated with unprocessed data yet starved for genuine understanding. They can answer many questions but cannot contemplate deeply enough to ask the right ones. This is why medieval scholars, despite having access to far fewer texts, often demonstrated deeper understanding than modern students with entire libraries at their fingertips. They had learned the contemplative art of transforming information into wisdom through patient intellectual digestion. Chapter 5: Sacred Memory versus Digital Storage. The contemplative mind as living library. Modern students have externalized memory to digital devices, treating their minds as processing units that access stored information when needed. Medieval scholars cultivated memory as a sacred capacity, not mere storage but a living contemplative practice that made wisdom immediately present to consciousness. The difference is profound. When you store information digitally, it remains external to your contemplative life. When you memorize contemplatively, ideas become part of your intellectual DNA, available for constant reflection and creative synthesis. Modern students can access any fact instantly but cannot think deeply about fundamental questions because they lack the memorized foundation for sustained contemplation. I have observed how digital dependence weakens the contemplative capacity. Students today read a text once, highlight key passages, and consider themselves finished. They can retrieve information when needed but have never internalized it enough for genuine understanding to develop. Their minds become like libraries with excellent cataloging systems but no resident scholars. Medieval memory cultivation was not rote memorization but contemplative internalization. Students would memorize texts slowly, returning repeatedly to deepen understanding through sustained reflection. Scripture, philosophy, and poetry became part of their contemplative landscape, immediately available for meditation and creative connection. This created minds that could think originally because they carried within themselves the living tradition of human wisdom. They could make creative connections because memorized ideas were constantly present to consciousness, generating new insights through contemplative synthesis. Their memory was not storage but contemplative presence. Modern learning science dismisses memorization as inefficient, preferring techniques for rapid information access. But this approach treats the mind like a computer rather than a contemplative organ capable of wisdom. When you externalize memory, you externalize the capacity for deep thought that depends on having rich content immediately present to consciousness. Consider the difference. A modern student researching Aristotle's ethics opens multiple digital sources, cross-references quickly, and produces a competent analysis. A medieval student who had memorized the ethics contemplatively could reflect on Aristotelian principles during walking, prayer, or conversation, generating insights through lived engagement with internalized wisdom. This is why memorization was considered not burden but liberation in the contemplative tradition. It freed the mind for sustained reflection rather than constant information gathering. Chapter 6: The Rhythm of Contemplative Learning versus the Anxiety of Optimization. Modern learning is driven by anxiety, the constant worry about falling behind, optimizing performance, and measuring progress through external metrics. This anxiety creates a restless energy that makes contemplative depth impossible. Medieval learning followed natural rhythms of rest and activity, silence and discussion, that allowed understanding to develop organically. The contemporary obsession with productivity hacks and learning optimization treats education as a problem to be solved rather than a mystery to be entered. Students approach learning with the same anxious energy they bring to competitive performance, creating mental habits that prevent the patient receptivity necessary for genuine understanding. I witnessed this anxiety in students who have mastered every study technique yet remain frustrated by their inability to think deeply about fundamental questions. They have been trained to optimize learning outcomes but never learned to enter the contemplative state where wisdom naturally emerges. Their minds are like gardens that receive constant fertilizer but never enough stillness to actually grow. The monastic tradition understood that learning requires alternating rhythms of activity and receptivity, effort and grace, seeking and finding. Contemplative learning cannot be rushed or optimized. It follows natural seasons of growth that require patience and trust in the process itself. Medieval students structured their days around liturgical hours that created space for contemplation between periods of study. This was not inefficiency but recognition that understanding deepens during rest as much as activity. Ideas need silence to ripen, just as wine needs time to mature. Modern methods promise constant progress through continuous optimization. But contemplative learning includes periods of apparent stagnation where understanding is actually deepening below the surface of consciousness. These fallow periods are essential for genuine insight, but optimization culture treats them as waste. The result is students who can perform learning activities efficiently but never experience the joy of contemplative discovery. They approach texts as problems to be solved rather than mysteries to be explored. Their relationship to learning becomes anxious rather than contemplative, productive rather than receptive. This anxiety pervades contemporary intellectual culture, creating minds that can analyze rapidly but cannot contemplate deeply enough to generate original insight. They have mastered the techniques of learning but lost the contemplative spirit that makes education truly transformative. Chapter 7: The Integration of Heart and Mind, Contemplative Learning as Spiritual Practice. The deepest difference between medieval and modern approaches lies in their understanding of the relationship between intellectual and spiritual life. Contemporary learning science treats thinking as a purely cognitive activity separate from moral and spiritual development. The contemplative tradition understood all genuine learning as a form of spiritual practice that transforms the whole person. When you approach study as contemplative practice, the boundaries between intellectual, moral, and spiritual development dissolve. Reading becomes a form of prayer, understanding becomes a moral virtue, and wisdom becomes a gift that serves not just personal advancement but the common good. This integration creates minds capable of genuine wisdom rather than mere cleverness. I have spent my life demonstrating how intellectual rigor can be deepened rather than diminished by spiritual practice. When students learn to study contemplatively, with patience, humility, and reverence for truth, they develop not just better analytical skills but intellectual virtues that serve them throughout life. Their minds become instruments of wisdom rather than mere tools for information processing. Modern education fragments the person into cognitive, emotional, and spiritual components, optimizing each separately. But authentic learning engages the whole person in contemplative relationship with truth. Ideas are not just understood but loved, wisdom is not just acquired but embodied, knowledge serves not just personal success but universal human flourishing. This contemplative integration explains why medieval scholars often demonstrated remarkable creativity alongside deep spiritual lives. They understood that the same contemplative attention that perceives God clearly also perceives truth most accurately. Prayer and study were not competing activities but complementary aspects of unified contemplative life. Contemporary students often struggle with meaning and purpose despite academic success because they have been trained to treat learning as instrumental rather than contemplative. They master techniques for academic performance but never discover education as a path to wisdom that transforms both mind and heart. The contemplative approach does not make learning less rigorous, it makes it more deeply rigorous by engaging intellectual virtues that pure technique cannot provide. Patience, humility, perseverance, and contemplative attention are not obstacles to clear thinking but its essential foundation. This is why the revival of contemplative learning methods is not romantic nostalgia but urgent necessity. Our world needs minds formed in wisdom, not just trained in technique. The integration of intellectual and spiritual life produces the kind of contemplative intelligence our complex age requires. Conclusion. The choice before us is clear: will we continue optimizing techniques for information processing, or will we rediscover the contemplative methods that form minds capable of wisdom? Modern learning science has given us powerful tools, but it has forgotten the fundamental purpose of education, the transformation of human consciousness through contemplative encounter with truth. The medieval tradition offers not outdated methods but timeless principles, that genuine learning requires patient attention rather than rapid processing, that understanding develops through contemplative reflection rather than information consumption, that wisdom emerges from integration rather than accumulation, and that authentic education transforms the whole person rather than merely training cognitive skills. These principles remain as relevant today as they were 8 centuries ago because they correspond to the deepest structure of human consciousness, our capacity for contemplative relationship with reality itself. No scientific optimization can replace the slow work of contemplative formation that creates minds capable of genuine insight. I invite you to experiment with these ancient methods in your own learning. Read slowly and repeatedly rather than rapidly and once. Memorize contemplatively rather than externally storing everything. Seek understanding rather than mere information. And approach study as spiritual practice rather than mere technique. Discover for yourself why contemplative learning produces deeper, more lasting formation than any modern method. The world needs minds formed in wisdom, hearts capable of genuine understanding, and souls that can contemplate truth clearly enough to serve human flourishing. This formation cannot be optimized, it can only be cultivated through the patient, humble practice of contemplative learning.